Right, so good morning, everybody. This is the ninth in our Talking Head series for the Land Use Net Zero People and Nature Hub. Today we're going to be interviewing George Monbiot and Simon Jeffery about the Earth Rover Program, which has caused a lot of interest in the soil science and the soil policy community, actually. So we're really privileged to have you both here today. We've got a long list of questions from very interested experts that we're going to share with you, and hopefully this will be a really rich conversation. I thought I would just kick off with some general questions around the origins of the idea. I understand you're both co-founders of the program, and George, your director as well, and Simon, I think you're science lead. So I think you have, a really rich story behind how this came into being and where it's going as well, actually. So it'd be really nice to hear the beginnings of the idea and how this group of people came together, and what led to the development of what's turned into something that looks incredibly interesting. And as well, if we can ask for a little bit of background and explanation around this term soilsmology, which you can imagine has got the academic community twitching. But I think that's a really interesting segue as well, George, into this whole question about how we communicate about these things and really capture people's imaginations.
I've been working for quite a long time on my book Regenesis, looking at how we could meet this twin challenge of making sure there's enough food for everyone without continuing to burst through planetary boundaries. And indeed, food and farming, the way that we currently feed ourselves, is to a remarkably large extent responsible for our breach of planetary boundaries. And it's very hard to see how we can sustain those systems with business as usual. And so there's an urgent need to do things differently. But as my research proceeded, it became very clear to me that one of the major impediments to doing things differently and doing them better is the very poor state of our knowledge of soils. And this is absolutely no disrespect to the many brilliant soil scientists who have been working to try to improve our knowledge for so long. It's inherently very difficult to study because it's dark. If you break it open by making a hole or taking a core sample, you've damaged the structure on which much of soil function depends. It's also been woefully underfunded for a very long time, and under-recognized, undervalued, which is crazy as we get 99% of our calories from soil. It's a slightly important ecosystem to us. And I kept bumping up against the constraints of insufficient knowledge because it seemed to me that, as we learn a bit more about the soil, there are so many crucial properties and crucial relationships, for instance, between plants and microbes, which we're just beginning to get a handle on. And if we could only understand those better and start to engage with those relationships, well, perhaps we could do farming differently. Perhaps even one day we could move away from chemical augmentation and towards biological augmentation of those relationships in the soil, for example. And indeed, many farmers I met are desperate for a better knowledge of the soil so that they can work with it better. And I worked in particular with this remarkable man, Ian Tolly, who has been able consistently to raise his yields while improving soil quality without the use of any inputs except a little bit of wood chip. And what he seems to have been doing is tweaking those relationships between plants and microbes. But it's been difficult to replicate his success. Some people have been able to do it very effectively. Other people have not. It's got something to do with soil properties. We're not quite sure what. So I kept banging my head against this wall. And in the book, I made this vague and rather desperate call for better soil science, more funding. We need, I said, an Earth Rover program because here we are spending billions of dollars on the Mars rover program to map the state of that planet's surface, which will never be able to support crops or support us in any way at all, while we know almost nothing about our own. And isn't that crazy? And that's the way it stopped when I'd submitted my book to publication. But soon after that, I met at my college. I've got an association with Wolfson in Oxford, a remarkable man called Taye Nissen-Meyer, who's a professor of earth sciences, of seismology in particular. And he had been on a quest as well, which was to find ecological applications of seismology, because the great majority of seismology is done on behalf of the oil and gas industry, and he didn't want to be part of that. He wanted to do beneficial things, which are actually going to help secure our future. And he'd already done some fascinating work, as he'd found that seismology can be used to track elephant communication. And indeed to identify other species crossing the savannah. It was a really fascinating papers that he and his colleagues produced on that. But he wanted to expand. He thought, this is an incredibly powerful technology, which, thanks to all the oil and gas money, has become highly sophisticated. So what can we do with it for good? And I thought he was an interesting guy. He seemed to think I was an interesting guy. So we arranged to have a drink in the pub, and we were chatting through our mutual problems, and it just went click. Hang on a moment. We talked about what seismology could do with soil, and it turns out that soil is a very good medium for seismology. You'd need ultra high frequency seismology, so you'd need to develop it a bit, but it seemed to us there was tremendous potential. And then we thought, well, someone must have done this before. And Taye did a literature search, and nothing came up. So then we thought, okay, the idea is obviously mad. I'll test it with Simon, who had given me great advice and help when I was writing Regenesis. And he'll tell us we're barking up completely the wrong tree. We must be crazy. And so that'll be the end of it. Simon, a very eminent soil scientist at Harper Adams University, from whom you're about to hear, now a professor of soil science there, I thought, is a very wise head, had been so helpful to me. So we arranged a meeting, and far from him telling us to bog off because there was nothing doing there, he actually got quite excited by it, and we began to see what tremendous possibilities there might be. So very soon afterwards, Simon and Taye wrote research schedule, an idea for kicking off the research. We founded an organization called the Earth Rover Program, the three of us, and then we brought in a brilliant operations consultant called Katie Bradford, and we went on from there.
Wow, what a story. That's a really great sort of wrap up of how this whole thing was born, George. Thanks so much. I mean, just to jump straight into the technical questions around that, what is it that distinguishes the Earth Rover program from existing soil monitoring approaches?
Definitely one for Simon.
Yeah, thanks, George. So one of the main things that's missing from a lot of soil monitoring programs is the fact that we really need to understand soil structure. So if you want to delve down into the soil, well, currently we can only do that by taking soil cores or digging soil pits. So that only really gives you information on the area that you've just destroyed by digging that soil pit or taking those cores. Another option is to use satellites, remote sensing, but they can cover large areas. They're non-invasive, but they really miss the depth of soil. And that's vitally important if you want to understand what's going on in terms of structure, if you want to understand what's going on in terms of soil organic carbon stocks. So what seismology does, what it kind of bridges the gap between the points that you start investigating. And what I mean by that is you send seismic waves through soil, and as they travel through that medium, they pick up information. And then you can use that information to interpret the kind of spatial dimension of soil that is currently so often missing from a lot of our analysis. You can scale this up by having more sensors or moving sensors around. And it really does give us a non-invasive way of characterizing soil structure across depth with a decent spatial resolution and depth resolution, such that you could use it to make decisions about agronomy. We're really talking about working at the decimeter scale. Some of our results go down to about 5 centimeters. So unlike some of the other approaches out there, electrical resistivity, where you kind of impose depth because you put your sensors down and you have a fixed depth that they're looking at, they kind of take the average over that entire depth. We can, by using different frequencies, we can change the resolution that we're looking at.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I mean, we had a question on how the tool is intended to complement other existing soil monitoring methodologies, such as, for example, remote sensing, ground penetrating radar, etc. I mean, you might feel like you've answered that already.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of remote sensing, what we can do is we can add depth. I mean, ultimately, we do plan on trying to combine different geophysical methods in order to get the greatest understanding of soil possible. Our initial focus is on seismology because that's something that hasn't really been explored at this depth. So we're not excluding the other things. We do hope to complement them. In terms of ground penetrating radar, obviously that's a very well established technique. It has a lot of strength and is very robust when you're using it for things such as exploring infrastructure. It's been used extensively for archaeology. A lot of these things are generally a bit deeper in soil than what we would need to understand in order to make inferences and draw conclusions about what we need to do in terms of agronomy. Ground penetrating radar very often struggles once you get up to the shallower depths of topsoils, 15 to 20 centimeters, because you get interference between the antennae. Not always, but it can create difficulties in interpretation. Again, in terms of density gradients, if you try to use ground penetrating radar to identify subsurface compaction, which can be a very large issue, as I suspect many of the viewers will be aware, ground penetrating radar often struggles to detect that. There was a PhD student who finished a couple of years ago at Harper Adams who basically concluded that, as well as difficulties around scalability, unless you have really, really like compacted iron pans, it struggles to be able to detect them. Seismology is very sensitive to those sorts of things, to these changes in bulk density that you get when you have subsoil compaction, because the seismic waves both reflect and refract from that interface. And so I think that our technique is basically very complementary to these other techniques that exist out there. We're not trying to replace all of the science that's already been done. We are very much trying to build on it and add another tool to the toolbox.
Brilliant, thank you.
Right, thanks, Simon. So is it going to be used by people like us, soil scientists, professionals, or is it going to be used by? Do you intend one day for it to be used by farmers and citizen scientists and stuff? Yeah, so how small is it? And, you know, are you going to be able to develop it to that sort of scale where it could be applied by citizens and scientists, farmers,
yeah, our aim is to try and make this as open and freely available as we possibly can. So Earth Rover Program is a not-for-profit organisation. We're not looking to try and make money off this. We are trying to do this for the improvement of our soil and the improvement of sustainability. Now, in terms of how things scale down and how they can be used, when we first went to the field, we used a laser vibrometer, which costs more than £10,000 and is a very fragile piece of equipment. It's not very good for field work. Since then, we've scaled down and are currently using relatively small geophones called LUNZ, which work at the ideal frequency that we want to use. We have a sensor engineer working at the moment with the sensors called MEMS sensors, which are the same sensors that you get in mobile phones. The idea is with them, they can then be wireless, and that will really help with scaling up. But ultimately, there's no reason why we won't be able to use mobile phones. So certainly in terms of citizen science, ultimately, we'd like to have an app that allows people to go out, put their phone on the soil or put it in a case and put it on the soil, depending on how wet the soil is. And then using something as simple as footsteps within the vicinity of the phone, that sends out seismic waves of the ideal type of frequency that you need if you want to try and characterize your soils. So we could literally be at the stage where if a farmer thinks, I've got subsoil compaction here, I wonder if I've got it over there, how much of my field do I need to subsoil? They can either use one of our sensors or go in with a phone, put that on the surface, wander around a bit, and the app will tell them whether they've got subsoil compaction there or not. If they've got it, how deep it is, how deep they need to go with the subsoiler to be able to alleviate it, and ideally whether the plough pan is actually dry enough that subsoiling is going to fix that problem or make it worse. So that's our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to make a tool that's available for everybody.
Yeah, brilliant. So what's the time scale for? Oh, sorry, George, do you want to come in there?
Well, I was just going to add something, Pete, that it's not just that we would like this to be available for citizen science. Citizen science is actually going to be crucial to our model because we need to populate a global database of as many different soil types and different conditions as possible in order for that to then be practically useful for farmers and other land managers and land users to be able to get direct usable results from their own soil osmology sampling on their own fields. And so so the idea, of having open source software, open source hardware, eventually, hopefully moving the whole thing onto mobile phones, is to make it as cheap and easy as possible for everyone to participate. In the earliest stages, we'll be relying on the goodwill of farmers and others around the world, helping us to build that database because it won't be immediately useful to people. But once we have got enough data, then and it is directly useful, then what we should see is lots of people wanting to be involved, and the database becomes self-improving as people use it for their own purposes. So we hope eventually to develop a kind of human genome project for the soil where we have characterized soils everywhere at pretty fine resolution and are able to discern key soil properties, states, and conditions in ways which haven't been possible to date.
Brilliant. So that was my next question was going to be how much expertise do you need to use it? It sounded quite technical to me when I first read about it, but you already said you intend to get this onto mobile phones, so it could be used just by people who know how to use a mobile phone and can step a few steps away, right? And then take readings, and that would go into a central database.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So one of the things that kind of blew my mind about seismology as I was coming to find out about it is developing the understanding that it's actually a linear system that we're dealing with.
Oh,
for me,
like most ones, yeah.
Yeah. For me, seismology had always just been an array of squiggles on a bit of paper that you see after an earthquake, and I kind of assumed because it's a load of weird-looking squiggles, it must be a chaotic system. And when they use that to infer just how powerful an earthquake was, they just look at the different sizes of the squiggles in order to infer that. But it turns out that's not the case. They do look at the size of the squiggles in order to infer how powerful earthquakes were, but actually they function as a linear system. So if you have an earthquake at point X and a sensor at point Y, if the earthquake increases in power, you get exactly the same squiggles. They're just bigger squiggles at point Y. And it's the fact that it functions as a linear system, which really means that we can tap into this as a tool. And it really means that it is basically foolproof. If you have anyone in it that can put their phone on the surface and walk around it, there's not much that they can do wrong, really.
Yeah, amazing. What's the sort of time scale that you're aiming at to get this down to mobile phones and usable by citizens?
So it kind of depends, really. It's likely that things will go in phases. So being able to detect changes in bulk density, we've already shown that's possible with the sensors that we've got. Being able to use that to detect subsoil compaction and getting that into sensors, that could just be a few years away. Getting to the stage that George is talking about, where ideally we would look at the wayfield of a soil and be able to interpret that as to whether the structure is degrading or improving, what needs to be done, whether organic matters are too low, what kind of interventions are required. That will be quite a few years further down the line.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah. Over to you, Ellie.
Yeah, thanks. And we were going to talk a little bit about the costs and implementation. I think we've covered some of it. We've had a lot of interest in the correlation between that the tool might offer around understanding soil carbon. And we haven't touched on it yet, and I think Pete, you're gonna look at this in more detail in a minute. But I guess the main question is, how does the Earth Rover program aim to reduce costs and crucially uncertainties around measurement, reporting, verification, the MRV of soil carbon, and those who are particularly interested in soil carbon?
Well, can I start off on this? That I've been pretty skeptical of soil carbon markets, I have to say, partly because the measurements simply aren't accurate enough at the moment to be able reliably to show increments and decrements of soil carbon. I mean, we don't even have accurate means of measuring soil volume at scale. You know, at a large enough scale to make sensible to be able to show sensibly how much soil we have, let alone bulk density, the amount of soil within that volume. And so the idea that we can reliably show from one year to the next whether you are accumulating or losing carbon currently seems to me to be quite implausible. And I think the soil carbon markets which have developed so far um, have been able to develop because the measurement isn't there. It's sort of speculative, and I think there might be some unpleasant surprises if measurement actually improves. Not least because we find that soils, aerated soils, those in use in agriculture, are likely quickly to saturate in terms of their carbon content, and that carbon can quickly be lost in droughts, for example. Now, what this shows is a general deficit in good data. I think we can greatly improve data across all of those metrics, including in the inference of soil carbon, about which Simon can tell you much more.
Yeah, so in terms of actual quantification of carbon stocks, well, as George just mentioned, what you need to know is soil volume. That's a key one. Under Tier 1 of the IPCC guidelines, you assume a depth of 0 to 30 centimeters. And I think the vast majority of people that work in this area are aware that that is frankly bonkers. Topsoils obviously are where you have the highest concentrations of carbon, generally, ignoring buried peat and things like that for now. But most commonly in the topsoil is where you find the highest concentrations of carbon. If that happens to be 30 centimeters, then using a 0 to 30 centimeter depth is perhaps reasonable. But there are very many soils where that assumption of the topsoil being 30 centimeters deep just doesn't stand up. There are, if you're working in Australia, many topsoils out there are more like 5 centimeters deep. If you're working in other places, I don't know, Chernozems in the mid-Eurasian steppes or whatever, you can be far in excess of 30 centimeters deep. So in either of those situations, you're going to be massively overestimating or underestimating the total amount of carbon stocks within that soil. Again, using this approach, one of the strengths of seismology is how you get these reflections and refractions at the interface. And we've already shown in one of the papers that we published that was specifically focused on peat, but by changing the frequencies, it will also work with mineral soils. If you do have horizon formation, because your soils are sufficiently old and well developed, when you send the seismic signals out, when they meet the interface between the A horizon and the B horizon, you'll get reflections and refractions. And you can use that to actually characterize the depth accurately and move beyond this need to assume specific depths. Even if you go out and take cores and measure those depths, you're still working with point assumptions, and then you have to extrapolate between those points. And again, just to bring this back to the peat paper that we used, their peat probing was done in order to measure peat depth, and our approach showed that that was off by about 20 centimeters because they were working on a 100 meter by 100 meter grid across Wixell Moss, which again was a pretty good effort to try and quantify carbon stocks. But because they're extrapolating and missing a lot of the topography that exists between the boundary between the peat and the substrata, the estimates were quite far off by about 20%. And again, by applying our approach, we can basically quantify those volumes of soil much more readily. On top of that, as well as quantifying volume, as the seismic waves go through soils, another paper that we published shows that they're very sensitive to bulk density. So rather than going out to a field that's however big and taking 3 or 4 bulk density samples and then assuming that that bulk density is uniform across the field, we can actually map that spatially. We've just finished doing our first hectare sampling. So just before Christmas, we sampled 1 hectare of the Harper Adams farm, looking to work down to about 1 meter depth because we're aware that that goes down into the subsoil. We're mainly focused on the topsoil at the moment. and that will be basically characterizing 1 hectare of soil to 1 meter depth with a 20 centimeter resolution. And throughout that, we'll be able to distinguish the A horizon from the B horizon and come up with a fairly accurate estimate of carbon stocks. We're going to compare that to the standard method and see basically how much error there would be in one method versus the other.
Brilliant. Do you have an idea at this point, sort of how much should it cost a farmer to scan a field and get the information they need?
At the moment, it's all done manually, so it would actually not be very cost effective at the moment, being frank, because we're still just moving beyond the proof of concept stage. We've shown that we can do bulk density, we've shown that we can do volumes. This is the first attempt to try and do things in a 3-dimensional way. We've been working in 2 dimensions up until now, but the plan is once we get these MEM sensors online, that will bring the cost down considerably. And we are looking probably in the future to try and develop more automated systems, looking at either rovers that drive over the surface, putting in sensors and vibrating as required, or drone swarms is another thing that's been discussed. Once we get down to the stage where things are a lot more automated, the cost will come down dramatically. But being frank, we are still very much at the lab and research stage at the moment. So it's not a cost-effective approach at the moment, but it will be in the future.
Cool.
Thanks.
Cool. So I've got a few questions now. What we did, we contacted a few fellow nerds, soils nerds, who just wanted to understand a few things about the system. So I'll ask them. We don't need too techie answers, but things like, I'll just kick off with it. It's a soil physics. It tells us about the soil structure, which is excellent. We need to know that. That's just one component of soil health, though. The physical indicators. There's also the chemical and the biological indicators. We'll come on to those in a minute. But just in terms of the physical indicators, can you explain how differences in soil moisture and bulk density show up differently in the signal? Can you distinguish them? Do you know what I'm saying? Basically, if you have a high bulk density, can you distinguish that from a wet soil?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great advantages of the seismic wave field is it's quite complex. It's actually made up of 4 different waves that all are generated when you have a seismic source, and they're sensitive to different elements of it. So by using the P wave analysis is what we've used so far in order to look at bulk density. By using the S wave, which is secondary wave, you can use that, and that's more sensitive to moisture. In fact, it's so sensitive to moisture, it's the fact that the S wave disappears as seismic waves pass through the center of the Earth that we know that the outer core is liquid rather than solid. So one of the real advantages of seismic waves rather than something like acoustics, which are basically just P waves, or electromagnetism, which is basically just a specific type of electromagnetic wave, we have these 4 different waves which are sensitive to different characteristics.
That's great. That's a real step forward just to be able to differentiate between those items. And what about soil compaction is really important as well. How does the sensors distinguish between just high bulk density, which just happens to be high bulk density, and where you've got a compaction occurring?
So basically, it looks at relative difference. It's not sensitive to high bulk density per se. I mean, that would show up differently to a low bulk density soils. You would end up with different wave velocities going through those soils. But in terms of compaction, what we're looking for is relative differences. So even if you have a high bulk density soil, like a clay soil that has a plough pan underneath it, it would still pick up that as a relative difference.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's basically where the question's coming from about the plough pan and things. And how does it perform in stony soils, the bane of a soil scientist's life?
So it's something that we're keen to explore. So as well as looking at P wave velocity, something else that you get with seismic waves is scattering. So as the waves go out through the soil, when they bump into all of these interfaces of different pebbles, for example, within the soil, you will get reflections and refractions, and they will show up in the tail of the seismic waves, the coda, as they technically call it. It's not something that we've explored yet. It is something we're very keen to explore, because obviously if you want to measure and quantify soil organic carbon stocks, then being able to remove stoniness from the estimate of the volume would be a very powerful tool. And that's something that we have to do manually at the moment if you want to get a decent estimate of it. And that's not very practical at the landscape scale. So it is something that basically in different soils, you get different signals, but the same physics apply across the board.
Brilliant. Thank you. And the next question is about the soil chemical properties, chemical indicators, and we've mainly dealt with the soil carbon one. You said that it's not predominantly aimed to measure differences in soil carbon. You don't think that's possible necessarily, but it could contribute to some of the things you need to know, like stoniness you've just said about, and estimating the total soil volume and the layer that you're interested in. So I could see that could be complementary if some people were using other methods, sort of near infrared sensors or something similar to do soil carbon change. And that comes back to Ellie's earlier question about how it could be used with complementary techniques. So I'll skip over those ones about soil carbon because I think you've already.
Just one
Sorry,
point on that. So Taye, who's the seismology lead that George mentioned earlier, he's fairly convinced that we should be able to quantify soil organic carbon. We're not sure to what level of resolution or sensitivity, but by looking at inference, by looking at how having soil organic carbon between the soil particles affects the elastic properties of the soil. So I wouldn't dismiss it as being not possible. It's something we are interested to look at in the future. So there is a possibility there, but it remains to be determined.
Yeah,
I think to get
it would
very
be amazing if
measures,
you could do that. Yeah, it'd be amazing if you could.
It would be amazing if you could.
Yeah. And I guess the big question is not can you just detect soil organic matter content? It's this small change against that large background. That's the bugbear of every measurement technique at the minute, isn't it?
Indeed. I suspect certainly for the foreseeable future, we will be combining it with other techniques like dry combustion or infrared or those sorts of things in order to get concentration, and then we just look at the bulk density and volumes.
Nice, thank you very much. And the last question is about the biological indicators of soil health. There are correlations between soil physical structure, which you can do very well, and soil biology. Are there any other aspects of biological properties that you can detect or infer with this technology, or again, are you looking for complementary technologies that could work alongside the seismology?
So structure is very much driven by biology in a lot of instances, as you're aware. So when you start looking at porosity, a lot of porosity, particularly once you're moving into finer textured soils than sandy loams, a lot of that is driven by microbial processes, with macropores driven by larger organisms within the soil, earthworms and the like. So certainly being able to detect those, porosity and connective porosity is something that we can look at. But there is also a plan at the moment. Bioacoustics is a growing field, of course, where people are using bioacoustics to listen for earthworms. Well, those acoustic waves are P waves, and there's no reason to suspect, as the earthworms are burrowing through the soil, they're not going to be generating seismic P waves and S waves as well. So there is already talk about trying to monitor and detect worm quakes, as it were, the vibrations caused by earthworms as they go through the soil. It's not something we've looked at yet, but it is something we're keen to explore. Yeah,
amazing. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you, Ellie.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to go on to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, but I'm going to come back as a complete layperson on behalf of all the other lay people who are going to listen to this later on. Can you describe, I go out into my field with this tool and I apply it. What picture is it giving me, and how is it giving me a picture of that can tell me about what is there inherently, as opposed to what is there through potentially a need for different practices or degradation, etc. So it's kind of going back to Pete's question about differentiating within context, but in really lay people's terms, if this did go global, how is it going to give us a picture that is nuanced to this other bugbear, which is around soil type, what's inherent and natural and what is, potentially causing the problems that George framed at the very beginning of this conversation?
So, at the moment, soil is very poorly mapped in general. I mean, even just soil types mapping is extremely rough and has got huge gaps in it. So Simon's got some great stats which he can tell you about just how low the resolution of global soil mapping is. So getting soil types, getting a sort of fine view of soil types is in itself a very useful thing to do. but then being able to show changes over time or being able to show degrees of degradation of those soil types is also very useful and can show, what gaps we need to close, how we need to improve soil, reverse degradation that has taken place so far. And we hope that as the global database builds, we can start to see more and more of that, and it therefore becoming gaining more and more immediate utility for people who are taking readings on their own land. And eventually, the idea is then to be able to pair that with agronomic advice to say, you might have the following deficits. You've got the following problems. This corner of the field is compacted, but the rest of it isn't. So if you're going to do subsoiling, do it there, but you don't need to do it in the rest. It might be able to help farmers to see how much or how little inputs they need. Because at the moment, of course, people are operating in the dark through guesswork and saying, well, I think the amount of NPK I'm going to need to apply is such and such. But if you've got a much finer, clearer view of what's going on in your soil, you can much more precisely tune those inputs to what you need. And the outcome of that should be lower inputs. The idea is that you can maintain your yields with the minimum degree of input. And at the moment, we know, for instance, when it comes to fertilizer, that somewhere between 2/3 and in some cases 3/4 of all the fertilizer applied is wasted. And it ends up as a massive environmental problem, polluting waterways, causing climate breakdown. We're all, I think, now aware of the problem of the over-application of nitrogen and phosphorus and other minerals. And so if we can tailor that much more precisely to what the soil needs, because we're able to show that more precisely, well, that straight away is a gain. And then further down the line, with an enhanced understanding of soil in general, but of your particular patch specifically, you might be able to start developing new agricultural techniques which build on that enhanced soil knowledge.
So would this be, just jumping in there, sorry, Simon.
No,
so
fine.
would you see this as a sensor that would actually go on farm machinery, like you use in precision agriculture, which would then tell the computer less fertilizer here, more here, subsoil here, don't subsoil there, that could actually be used in real time on a tractor or on the implements that you're using behind it? Or is this something that you just do once? You only have to go over the field once, and then all you need to know about that field, and you've just got a map that you can then use for the future.
Definitely one for Simon.
Yeah, well, whether we can go on directly onto the tractor or if it needs to go as a device in front of it or is pulled behind it will remain to be seen. One of the key things is that you need to make sure you're getting seismic frequencies going out within the right frequency range.
Yeah.
We have been using, doing explorations, we're using things like whacker plates and tractors and all sorts of things to see what kind of seismic signals you get from them. Some of them do put out useful frequencies, but some of them have kind of weird kind of patterns within them, which can cause more noise, basically.
Of course, I hadn't thought of that.
Soils are dynamic systems, as you know, so how frequently you need to do it, that also remains to be seen. Structure can degrade quite rapidly once you cross various thresholds, and so if you're near a threshold, maybe you'll need to scan more frequently. If we can get to say where we can detect that you're far away from a threshold, we don't know if that's possible yet, of course, but what we hope, maybe you don't need to scan so often. If you think you've got subsoil compaction, then scanning is probably sensible, so you can just minimize the amount of diesel you need to burn in order to only subsoil the places that need to be subsoiled.
Yeah.
To go back to your question, Ellen, and it probably links in with the future questions about AI, so feel free to come back with any kind of follow-ups that you like. But we work with an AI specialist at the moment who's an excellent fellow. He's gone through and taken all of the data that's publicly available as part of the Lucas soil database and has formatted it in such a way that it can be accessed by large language models. So we've linked it with through an agent with ChatGPT, and on the website at the moment, it's freely available. You can go onto the Earth Rover Program website and access ERP GPT. And basically that's ChatGPT, but it has access to all of the data that's available in the Lucas soil data sets going all the way back to 2009. And you can ask it questions like, I don't know, what's the average soil pH of East Anglia within the UK? And it will access that information from the database. That's going to eventually be further developed into something known as an any to any transformer. And I'm not an AI person, so if you want a lot more information about this, I'd have to get Kundai on board to talk about it. But basically, the seismic signals which are generated will be converted into a way that AI can read it. And that will then communicate with the database. And by looking at data that's been collected historically, it will be able to draw inferences around what your soil should have been like under natural situations by comparing it to how that data is from other databases, and then looking at how it is now. That's kind of the broad picture and my understanding of this AI malarkey that's going to be used. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question somewhat, Ellen.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. It does answer the question. Yeah, and also your answer, your comments on AI. That's really helpful as well to understand how these things are starting to fit together with other big sort of AI pictures and sources, if you like. I guess leading on from that, it would be really nice to hear how you see farmer knowledge, because of course, people are coming with their wealth of wisdom that they already have. So how is that incorporated into AI models, and what type of information is currently being collected, in that way? And also, I wonder if you could say anything, if relevant at all, about ground truthing.
Yeah, so in terms of ground truthing, all of our data at the moment is being ground truthed by taking physical samples and analysing them in the lab for bulk density, for soil organic carbon, all of these other parameters, aggregate stability, and the like. If you look at one of the papers that we published, it's Between Two Furrows, that looks at bulk density. You'll see we did some very high density biological bulk density sampling, whereby after doing the seismic readings, we dug out a soil pit and then took out 200 bulk density cores at 10 centimeter resolution in order to be able to then validate that against the bulk density information that we're getting. So we're very keen to do this in as scientific a way as possible. We come from a science background, so yeah, ground truthing is really vital.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit, because of course that makes absolute sense in the development stage, but if we're talking about farmer use or layperson use, citizen science, etc., is there an element of kind of guided ground truthing that other people can be involved in as things develop?
Yeah, so we are keen to engage with farmers. I mean, certainly when we're start reaching out with farmers, we get as much information as we can from them about land use and what they've been doing, and we'll be feeding that information in. As for whether we actually need that information further down the line to be able to draw inferences around the soil, once the database is big enough, we should be able to compare and contrast across different systems such that that's not needed. Mm-hmm. But we do want to engage with farmers. Farmer knowledge is obviously vital. There is a plan to within the app to try and set up a peer-to-peer knowledge transfer system. So if farmers can talk about, I've got this soil, I've been seeing this problem with it, other farmers can chip in and say, well, have you tried X, Y, or Z? So we want to do this in a very open and collaborative way, and certainly farmer knowledge is a very valuable tool when it comes to knowing how to best manage soils.
Brilliant. That leads on to my next question in a way. You're a soil scientist, you're working on this, you've got other soil scientists at Harper Adams, I guess. Are you encouraging other soil scientists to come and test out the program and to think up new applications and new places to test and such like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we want to do this in a collaborative way. So we have a couple more soil scientists at Harper Adams. We have a couple out in Colombia as well, based at SEAT. We have one working with a seismologist in Kenya as well. So we're trying to capture a wide range of different ecosystems. But certainly, we're very engaged. We're very keen to engage with the scientific community about this to see what other things we could be doing if people want to try and test things. We're slightly limited in resources at the moment because it's still fairly early days, but certainly we're happy to have conversations and see what can be done.
Yeah, great. Yeah, presumably if people were writing grant applications, they could write you in to, if you say you've got limited resources, they could write you in for some resources, etc. Giving you an open goal there to advertise for
absolutely. No, we're very keen to have those conversations with people.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Simon. Over to you, Ellie.
Well, just to wrap up, I thought it'd be nice to talk a little bit about future development and sense of direction. And this might be one for you, actually, George. What lessons and findings have emerged during the development of the Earth Rover Program?
Well, for me, it's been extremely exciting, perhaps the most exciting thing I've ever been involved in. And it's quite unexpected for me. I'm basically a journalist, but stumbled into this. And I think, my hope is that it could lead us towards what I see as the holy grail of farming, which is high yields with low impacts. Because the fundamental problem, as I came to see it after that work on regenesis, was that you get high yield farming, which has very high environmental impacts, and low yield farming, which has low environmental impacts. And we're not really going to fix this great multifaceted quandary we're in, where it comes to food production, without bringing the best of the two systems together. So to have high yields with low impacts, and very few people have been able to achieve that. That the reason for that has a lot to do with our understanding of soil, and it's our belief that if we can understand that much better, then that could help more people to achieve that lovely place where your yields are high, your inputs are low. And of course, in rich nations like this, much of the problem is the over application of farm inputs. In poorer nations, many people are greatly limited in terms of the farm inputs that they can use. They just don't have enough money, so their yields are limited, and some people would need to raise their inputs to improve their yields. But the danger in both cases is that without clear and accurate knowledge of exactly what you need to do, how much is required, if you can afford it, you're going to over apply with escalating environmental problems. Now, obviously, we're not going to solve all of the environmental conundrums which are now facing the food and farming system, let alone the wider systemic problems like the systemic instability of the global food system, which I think is very great and very pressing. It looks very much like the financial system in some respects in the run up to 2008. There are huge problems. There are huge environmental shocks hitting. One of the things which keeps me up most at night is soil moisture, and sort of very significant declines in soil moisture, which we're likely to see with increasing global heating. It's going to be really difficult to deal with that. I'm not sure what the answers are. There's lots and lots of challenges and problems, and we're not claiming to solve all of them by any means at all. But we think that we can make a contribution in both improving farming and reducing its environmental impacts, as well as in general improving the knowledge of soil science, our understanding, our appreciation of soil. And all of those things can help us to resolve one aspect of the polycrisis that now faces us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's that really sharp focus on agriculture and food supply. Do you see any applications for the tool beyond agriculture?
Yeah, very, very much so. In fact, one of the first people we were talking to was a regulator. I don't think I can say who, but a government regulator who is very, very keen to see this developed as quickly as possible. Basically say, just give it to us now, because at the moment, you might be paying farmers to protect and improve their soil, but you've got absolutely no means of telling in a reasonable, cost-effective way whether they're doing so. So basically, it's like if someone has ticked the box saying I'm looking after my soil, they'll get subsidy money for that. We now have this European directive on soil health and soil monitoring, which is meant to make this mandatory, but there's absolutely no means of implementing it with the current state of knowledge. So I think it could be very useful for regulators. I think it could be something which, and I hope very much, for citizens in general, it just increases our understanding, our enthusiasm for soil, our connection with soil. I mean, it really is the most fascinating and extraordinary ecosystem. You can go halfway around the world to see a coral reef, but you might have greater diversity and amazement right under your feet where you're standing. Admittedly, you might need a lens for it, but you will see extraordinary things. And the more you understand, the more astonishing you realize it is. And just soil behaves in ways which are very different to other ecosystems. It's a biological structure, but it's got all these weird and fascinating properties. So anything which can enhance that relationship, enhance our enthusiasm and knowledge, but at the same time have these direct practical applications, well, I think that's going to be good for us and good for the living planet.
Absolutely. Well, finally, we were wondering if you have any clear next steps for the programme.
That one for Simon, I think.
Yeah, we're further developing into other soil systems and other soil types. We're looking to try and develop this as a soil health metric, so getting something like the equivalent of the visual evaluation of soil structure, but without having to go and dig holes, just a sensor you can put on the surface and it can give you kind of that structural information. Further developing and upscaling so that we can have things, so we're working wirelessly so that we can scale things up more readily. And then, engaging with the wider community as well.
Brilliant. Well, it's been really fascinating, really grateful for your time. And we're really looking forward to sharing all of this with our community.
Thanks both.
Thanks so much.
No, thank
Great to talk to you both. Thanks so much for taking the time.